I grew up in an old-fashioned kind of Christian home. It was Sunday morning, we were in worship. That was normal. It wasn't a matter of where are we going today, what's on the schedule for this Sunday. Everything else was just built around corporate worship. And because of that, I find that some of the earliest memories that I have in my mind are corporate worship, of being the body gathered together, a Sunday morning, whether in the nursery or the Sunday school classroom. And a lot of them are actually just from corporate worship. Being that little kid trying to look up over the pew, eyes kind of hovering just like that. And one of the earliest memories that I have of being in corporate worship, the body gathered together, is that of the plate being passed during the service, and my mom or dad giving me a $1 bill to put in it. So they put their envelope in, and when it goes by me, I've got $1 or $2 or 50 cents or whatever my mom just happened the last minute to kind of put into my hand. And I think one of the reasons why it stands out in my mind 40-something years later is that it made an impression on me. I do remember that there was some sort of activity. It's me actually participating in worship as a kid. As a little child, in that moment, I realized I'm actually a part of what's going on here. And I thought that was pretty cool. And it was something to do other than drawing pictures on the back of the bulletin. It was a way to engage during the service. So what I knew was that it was fun, it was interesting, it was different, it was participatory. But what I didn't know at that time was that my mom and my dad were teaching me a deep, deep truth about God. As I was putting that token amount into the plate, I knew that it was something different. I knew that it was something reliable. I mean, every service at this very specific sort of high church kind of way, the plate's gonna come in between these two songs right here and right before the doxology and all of that. I knew that, but what I didn't know, as a little kid, putting just a little bit of money into the plate, that I was experiencing something and learning a truth about God. This morning we are starting a two-part series on giving to the Lord. It's called the head and the heart of giving. And the reason why it's two parts here in Deuteronomy, it's just one passage called tithes in my NIV, is because I think it's important to acknowledge at least two parts about the function of giving. Like, what happens when a few minutes ago, Mitch is standing here talking about offering, and we've got these options. There's a box, there's online, you can snail mail it. Every week we have that moment where we pause and reflect on the fact that we give to the Lord, give to the church. There's a couple categories that we should think about when we actually think about giving. One is the head, there's the theology, like, why do we do it? And are we standing on firm footing? Because it'd be easy to give, especially as a little kid, and say, well, that just happens to be the time the plate's cruising by my nose. That's why I'm giving. My mom just gave me $1, and I know I'm not going to buy like a Snickers bar with it. I know like it's going to go into the plate. There's that basic level we give because that's what we do. But are we rooted theologically? Do we have a solid vision of what God says about giving biblically? So that's the head. And then next week, we're going to talk about the heart of giving. Because while it's a very important function, and pragmatically, it's like it keeps the lights on, right? It gives us a space to gather and to worship. Pragmatically, we get that. But what's actually happening in here? Because the Lord looks at the obedience to His glory. Right? He understands He wants the lights on too. He gets that. But He sees something. As we are people who give to ministry, give to the Lord, there's something happening on the inside. It's just like baptism, an outward expression of an inward change. When we give to the Lord financially or otherwise, right? We give of ourselves in a number of different ways. It's an outward expression of something that exists, something that lives on the inside. Hence the two-part series, the head and the heart of giving. Now Moses, as he's preparing his people to, his desires that they thrive in the new land, as they cross that river and they do life well in the new land, he hits every topic, every subject imaginable, and he wants them to be sort of a comprehensive people of God. And he gives them all this advice, instruction, and very specific commands of the Lord. And one of them, and this is the first time of several times that it's going to show up in Deuteronomy, has to do with giving of themselves. We typically think of giving as a financial transaction, right? It's put the check, put the dollars and cents, attach it to a credit card, whatever. While that's a significant part of it, giving to the Lord is a much broader category. And there's lots of ways that we give: time, treasure, talent. And here, in chapter 14, starting with verse 22, Moses talks about the harvest. That's where he starts off. He says, be sure to set aside a tenth of all that your fields produce each year. A tenth. That's where the word tithe comes from. Tithe means 10%. So as they look at sort of the big picture of all that they harvest, whether it's the wheat or their wine or their olive oil or their herds or their flocks, they need to do some math and come up with 10%. That's the starting place. And the first thing that stands out to me about this is we think about this idea of giving, the biblical model of giving, is that it's deliberate. There's a deliberate component to it. Verse 22, be sure to set aside. What's that tell us? It's not accidental. This part of it's not haphazard. And I think there really is a place for being spontaneous. It's like that week where you get that bonus at work you didn't realize it was coming and you hadn't really planned on it, and it's like, okay, wasn't thinking of this today, but I'm going to give here. That's a little more casual, that's spontaneous. Here is the idea is presented to us. The starting place is actually deliberate. So it's built right into their calendar. Be sure that you set aside a tenth of all your fields produce each year. And that's important because if we're casual about it, then it tends to be more like what we call the leftovers. Okay, I'm going to do life, I'm going to budget, and I have all these things that are non-negotiable, not to be taken off the table. These are important, and then what's left over. Right? That's the way that some people can approach things like giving to the church. What we see here, the original model is it actually starts with, no, it's built right in. It's a concrete thing in the life of God's people. Now, here's the interesting part. Instead of simply bringing 10% and putting it at the Lord's feet, here's the instruction. Eat the tithe. Eat it. Actually consume it. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine, olive oil, the firstborn of your herds and flocks, in the presence of the Lord your God at that place, at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. So we've already talked about this place. It's something in the future, something that will ultimately become the temple that King Solomon's going to build. So at some point, King Solomon is going to build the temple, and Moses is saying, you will take a tenth of all your stuff here, bring it to that temple, and instead of just handing it over and leaving, eat it. You're actually going to consume it. And I'm trying to wrap my head around, that's a lot of grain, that's a lot of wine, that's a lot of whatever, but nonetheless, here's the instruction, and it's for the whole family. It's all of your people. You're going to bring it, and you're going to consume it. And while you're consuming it, it's actually symbolically designated for the Lord. And what's the net result? What does this do to you? other than, okay, well, I weigh a lot more when I left than when I arrived. There's that part of it. But like, what's the model here? Like what's actually happening at the end of verse 23? So that you may learn to revere the Lord your God. Always. Okay, let me get this straight. So we just had a big harvest. There's the grain, there's the wine, there's the olive oil, there's the herds, the flocks. You get the cattle, you've got the sheep. I take out my ancient calculator, I'm doing the math. It's like, okay, we're bringing all of this to the temple. And now we're going to gather, we're going to consume it, quote unquote, in the presence of the Lord. And where's Moses driving this? Is he simply saying so that you'll be obedient and God will see that you're obedient? I think that's implied. But like, where's the target that his arrow is headed for? What's it going to do to the people of God? So that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. That word revere is often translated, I know Drew's got an ESV in front of him, it probably says fear, right? So that you may learn to fear the Lord. Biblical fear for the people of God is actually a good thing. Right? It's deep sense of reverence. It's not fear like that. Fear is respect and reverence for the Lord. So something about taking this percentage of food and harvest and all of that and consuming it in the presence of the Lord will result in deep-seated respect for God. How does that work? How do you go from one to the other? Well, first of all, they're bringing it to the presence of the Lord. In other words, they're being confronted like face to face. The temple is really the symbolic presence of the Lord, but in their minds they're going and they're like, oh, nothing reminds me more of God than being here at his temple. And that was the design. And here they are consuming. What's the connection? The understanding that everything, absolutely everything good comes from the Lord. And when you realize in your mind, okay, that harvest, that grain, that olive oil, that wine, those herds, the flocks, ultimately come from the Lord. It creates this sense of reverence, this sense of awe, this sense of appreciation. Lest we forget. Are people prone to wander and prone to forget? I just flip back to chapter 8. Moses is saying, don't forget the Lord. Verse 17, you may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. It's easy to go in that direction. When that paycheck comes in. When the studs go up on the house. When that addition goes on, that bonus comes in and there's the pool. We're tired at the end of the day or at the end of the week. Get that cash flow, whatever it is. I built this, I own this, I did this. That sense of pride. No, I own it, it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. And the Lord says, I give you the very breath in your lungs. The blood that's coursing through your veins, I am the origin of that. That wheat, that grain that you harvest in your field. If I give you an overcast summer without any rain, what happens? Nothing. The Lord says, take a percentage, you will consume it. You're not going to use it, you're not going to designate it for the college fund. Okay? University of Canaan, whatever they called it. You're not going to designate it here, you're not going to build it, your choice. That's not You're not going to designate it for this. You're not going to, no. You're going to come, you're going to consume it. But the symbol is, this is the Lord's. And when we do it in his presence, that little transaction, it signals to us or to them, it's all the Lord's. He's the origin. He's the one who gives us increase. He's the one who blesses us. And then moving from there, so this is a build up the people of God. Let's yet another way to help them keep from forgetting who he is and that he's the one that gives them all that they have. And then there's a transition to this Another practical matter. But if that place is too distant for you, too distant and you've been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord will choose to put his name is too far away, then exchange your tithe for silver. And take the silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. So there's an accommodation here. And this actually speaks of God's heart in this moment. Notice how the Lord is not trying to cripple his people. This isn't a punishment. This isn't about being heavy-handed on the people of God. He wants to create something that's sacrificial. We should feel it. 10%. I mean, that's a real number. That's a real percentage. But it's not designed to overwhelm the people. And he shows that in saying, no, if the Lord gives you incredible blessing, and yet you live so far away that it's just a little too far to haul it, the Lord will designate another place, and you exchange it for silver, and you take that silver, which is much easier to carry than a wagon load of whatever, a cart of whatever, bring that there, and then you have these options you can purchase and do the same thing. Eat it, consume it in the presence of the Lord. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drink, anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. This is a joyful thing. There's responsibility, there's obedience in it, right? We're to be deliberate, we're to be on purpose about this, yet rejoicing. See that connection between reverence or fear of the Lord and rejoicing? We can do both at the same time. We can be in complete awe of who God is and praise his name. And this whole idea of offerings, bringing to the Lord, it's all connected in that way. And then there's the Levites. So as we're thinking through, like what's the original model for offering? Well, it instills in us a sense of awe and wonder. That's a wonderful thing. And then there were these the Levites, the tribe of Levi, and they were the only ones who did not get an allotment of land in the Promised Land. They were the one tribe who didn't get that. Okay, and you're up there on that hillside, go north, west, whatever. You didn't get that allotment of land because their inheritance is the Lord. This is where the priesthood came from. And they were to rely, quote unquote, on the Lord. That means that the people of God would sustain them through their offerings. If you were a priest or of the tribe of Levi, in that sense, the people would give you. So there's compassion in that, but it's really built right in as a way of obedience. So we're getting into some more pragmatics. It shapes us when we give to the Lord. It shapes the way that we think and our appreciation for the Lord, but it also keeps the lights on, as it were. And for the Levites, it's like, well, this is it. They don't have like a side hustle, right? This isn't a part-time gig. No, they act, they serve, they do the ministry, and the people sustain them. And that's their inheritance is the Lord. That means that what people are bringing to the Lord in obedience and reverence and joy, a portion of that goes to the people of Levi, and that sustains them. So we get into that pragmatic category of why do we give? Theologically, biblically, why do we give? Shapes us, but it also has practical purpose. And then along with that sense of compassion, now we get deep into this idea of compassion. Verse 28, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns. Okay, at the end of every 3 years, we're going to take 10% there and we're going to store it in our towns. And what's the purpose? What's the function of this? So that the Levites, we were just talking about them, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns, they come and eat and be satisfied. So that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So it comes right back to the Levites. So there's this whole other category of tithe at the end of every 3 years. So that the Levites, we understand that, right? They don't have their own land. They don't have their own, they're not farming out there. So they're depending on the people's obedience plus their compassion. And then there's this other grouping, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows. Who do they represent? Put yourself in their place in more than 3,000 years ago. If you're a foreigner wandering in a foreign land, no place to call your own. Probably don't understand the language. If you're a Gentile in the midst of the Jews, you're like, okay, I'm not a part of these people. Not yet. Vulnerable. These categories represent the most vulnerable of their time. Those who didn't have a dad or a husband. Right? Who was the quote-unquote bread maker of the day? Who was responsible for that financial security of the day? Who was responsible for that whole model of inheritance, social security down through the ages? Well, it was the dad. You take him out of the equation, you've got some very vulnerable people on your hand. Foreigners, the widow, those without a dad, the fatherless. And giving to the Lord and giving to the ministry was also an act of compassion. It was a way of showing their hearts to God in order to show God's heart to the people. You follow that? It was their way of showing their heart to God. Okay, Lord, this is what you have instructed me to do. I'm being faithful here. Here's my heart. We'll talk more about that next week. But here's my heart, Lord. We show the Lord our hearts in order to show the heart of the Lord to other people. And we're reminded just like that of a compassionate God who we love and who we serve. Sometimes we get caught up in these laws and legislation. You can think, okay, well, he just has rules. A lot of our culture thinks that. We don't like church because it's all rules. Rules without purpose. No, it's rules built on love and a compassionate God who gets this broken world and sees in it and wants to work in and through his people to glorify his name. Just a little glimpse of it right here. I get a little hung up on this verse here. I believe that for our passage, there's a real hook in there. Not to dismiss the other stuff. Giving is practical. There's compassion. He ends this passage by saying that the Lord may bless us. But clearly Moses knows that there's a people that need to be shaped and formed. They need structure. We need structure. And that our activities in worship are not just one way. It's not just giving to the Lord. As we give, it shapes us. As we sing these songs, we see these lyrics that show up on the screen. We're proclaiming truth to God. We're glorifying his name, literally highlighting the glory of God with our voices. But as we do that, it's reinforcing who he is to us. Sing Psalm 100 over and over for a little while, and all of a sudden it's just like you buy in on a whole, your soul buys in on a whole new level. And here Moses is saying, okay, take 10%, you're going to go, you're going to consume it, but you're going to do it in the presence of the Lord. And when you're at the temple, you can't help but notice. It's like sitting at the foot of the cross. You can't help but appreciate. It's like taking communion, right? The bread and the cup. You can't help but reflect deeply on what's happening, like what's the source of this? And it shapes us. That's a part of our theology of giving. As we give to the Lord, we acknowledge that everything is his, and it creates this sense of awe and wonder and respect. You'll see me walk around, you'll notice that I'm a little slower than usual today. A little hobble in my walk, a little limp. A little extra scruff up here. We're in the middle of the first week, full week of sugaring up north. So we've been boiling all week. I'm going back up after this, back up to Jen and Gracie. and we'll be back at it for a little while. I absolutely love it. I look forward to it all year, but it's also a ton of work. I mean, it's a ton of work. Ann always nods. She's like, yes, yes. And related to that, what's that?
It's so worth it.
It's so worth it. It's so worth it. Related to that is, anybody who makes sugar, like maple syrup, like, you don't let your kid pour the maple syrup until they're 18. Like, they have to be of age. They have to be of age. And really, if you buy it too, you're like, do you know how much that costs?
Right.
To just casually be pouring it, and you're like, you can't waste not even a single drop, because so much work goes into it. It's not even hauling the buckets of sap around, it's tapping the trees. And before you tap the trees, you gotta cut down the tree and cut the logs and split it and let it season for an entire year, and you're hauling that around, you're breaking a sweat every direction you go. And then you start hauling the buckets of sap, and just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of gallons into the tank and up to the sugar shack. And then you gotta take it and you put it in the evaporator, and you're throwing in the firewood, and everybody's sweating. And it's super hot. I don't know what day it is. I don't know what time it is. Like, did I put diesel in the tractor? I have no idea. Somebody's got to think of these things, and then I got to haul the wagon back and forth, and I love it, but I can't see straight at the end of the day. And it's like, Gracie, I'm going to pour that. You're not going to pour it. And then I thought, instead of simply saying, that's a lot of work, or do you know how much that costs? Here's an idea. What if you help me make it? Then you know. You can instill this appreciation. And yesterday, I was telling Joy before the service, I've got this video, and you can see it on request. She's holding the bucket on her arm like a purse. And she's walking, she comes out of the sugar shack like this. She looks over and she goes, "Where's the syrup?" And then she just falls over. It's like my favorite moment of the day. And I love it, it's family time, but it also occurred to me, sort of as a background, it's like, if she starts making this stuff and doing the heavy lifting, she's gonna appreciate what she's making, and at some point, she's gonna be very careful when she pours that maple syrup on there. And maple is just one of many trades where that's the truth. If you do it, you appreciate it. It's like, all right, I'm gonna give you some money, but I'm gonna ask you to work a little bit so you appreciate how much that money costs. Like, where does it actually come from?
It comes from the Lord. How cool is His creation?
From the Lord. When we give of ourselves in a reflective manner, whether it's at the temple or in this case, in community, to take that moment and say, Lord, you give me the very breath in my lungs. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me, but remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth. He gives us the ability. And when we give back to Him, a lot of things are happening in that moment. It's an expression of faith. It's keeping the lights on, right? It's an operation blessing. It's meeting the needs of those who are less privileged, those who are the most vulnerable in our midst. God blesses us in and through that, but it also shapes us. And it forms us. And that's why, here we are in sort of a new age of digital giving. We've got a box in the back. Snail mail's always been an option. Along with that comes a little bit of a liability. And what I mean by that is, like for Jen and I, we just give monthly. It's a convenience thing. We give monthly, it's easy for the math, it's easy for the transaction. But the liability of something like that, potentially, if we're not deliberate about it, is that we miss those opportunities to do deep reflection. So what I encourage people is when that time of offering comes, every week, even if you give once quarterly and just sort of lump sum it together, whatever works. The Bible doesn't say you must do this weekly, it gives us a model. Is that every time you think of offering, every time you see those images up on the screen, take a moment and reflect and say, I've already given, I gave 2 weeks ago, I'm right in the middle of this month. But I'm reminded in this moment, Lord, that everything comes from you. A very popular question is, well, are we commanded to tithe? I see tithe here on the page, very specific about 10%. This is before Christ, so like there's a question mark there. Was this built into the Old Testament law? Is this a moral law that kind of comes over, like the Ten Commandments? Don't commit murder, don't commit adultery, you must tithe. Does it work like that? And here's the short answer. Amongst conservative evangelical groups, this is a disputable matter across the board. There's some people say, absolutely, we are commanded to tithe just like they were long ago and far away. And some say, no, we're not commanded to tithe. And me, my sensibility, and this is my understanding of Scripture, is that we're not. We're not commanded to tithe. And what I mean by that is that when I look in the New Testament and it comes up in some different language, I don't see any specific command to tithe, as though every time the paycheck comes out, you gotta get out the calculator and that's my blatant obedience to the Lord. What we do see in the New Testament, though, Paul does use the language of obedience, and he talks about giving generously. He talks about giving sacrificially. He talks about giving cheerfully. He talks about all of that. And Drew pointed this out months ago, and I thought it was the best summary of how I read the Scriptures, is that while we're not commanded to tithe in the New Testament, we're commanded to give sacrificially, to give faithfully. In the Old Testament, it's our blueprint. It's our model. That's what it's built on. So I believe that it's the model that we have, and that the Spirit leads us as we give. So it takes deep reflection. And what you see in the Old Testament tithe is that it was sacrificial. I mean, they felt that. Even if they're just bringing it to the temple and they're going to consume it, like, you don't designate it over here and over there and do this and do that. Or giving it to the Levites or giving it to the foreigners. It was sacrificial, 10% is a real number, but it wasn't crippling. And ultimately, it was something to be done with joy and rejoicing. So in summary, I don't see the tithe as a hard and fast rule for Christians on this side of Jesus. Great subject to research, dig deeper into it, but I do see it as the blueprint. I do see it as the model. And we're called to give faithfully, give sacrificially, give lovingly. And my hope today is that as we do, we're standing on some solid ground, theologically. Mindful that along with all those other things of sustaining a budget, taking care of those in need, that something's supposed to happen to us when we do it. Something's really supposed to happen. Maybe we hear those words of Paul, and we'll get into this more next week. But Jesus became poor, that we could become rich. And to Mitch's point during the offering, it's not like, whatever that means, right? Financially rich. It's not that. We have everything we need in Christ. If you can picture my little hand going into the offering plate as a kid, it must have been fun because I can remember it. I remember a lot of things. I enjoyed it. It was interesting. Let's mix things up during the service. But as I get older, I realize, okay, something was being modeled for me that's transformative. Something was being modeled for me that's theologically rich. It goes back thousands of years. It's a reflection of God's heart. It meant so much more than just participating in that moment, as special as that is. An opportunity to show God my heart, and in doing so, we show the world His heart.